Ben Shapiro is known for his quick wit, hyper-conservative views, and rarely ever losing a debate. But when he sits in front of Dr. William Lane Craig, all bets are off. Listen, this video has been around for a minute. I'm sure you've probably seen it, but it's so good I gotta share it on my channel. William Lane Craig discusses Jesus with Ben Shapiro, and it is a phenomenal discussion. I cannot wait to show you some of the highlights of this video. So let's just watch as this thing goes forward. Let's do it.
So why do you need the idea of a revelatory God who speaks to human beings?
The arguments that we've discussed already narrow down the field of the world religions to basically the great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or perhaps deism. The question as to which of these is true, I think, stands or falls upon the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was?
Okay, so before he starts, this is the line in the sand right here, Jesus Christ. How do you get from atheism to theism? Well, you can use a cosmological argument, teleological argument, ontological argument. You can use arguments to get from atheism to theism. How do you get from theism or deism to Christianity or the true faith? That is Jesus Christ. Let's continue.
Jesus claimed to be the decisive self-revelation of God. And I believe that we have good reasons to believe that those claims were true and that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the gospel?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
I love how Dr. Craig presented the religio-historical evidence that any Jewish person can verify and recall, because Jews know their history. He presented that evidence for Jesus because that is what really matters, because they know prophecy, they know scripture, the Old Testament. And Jesus Christ called himself the Son of Man, which is a unique name. Many called themselves Son of God, but Christ called himself the Son of Man, entitling himself as the Messiah, saying that he is distinct and unique. And this got him into trouble because this is a radical view of oneself. To call oneself the Son of Man, this super popular title from the prophet Daniel. This is why they called him a blasphemer. And this is why Jesus was in the position he was in, which ultimately led to his crucifixion, among other things. But Ben Shapiro is not going to give in that easily. Let's continue.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense, even. That there are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that'd be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous.
Sufficient retort from Dr. Craig, but people like Ben Shapiro, they will find a way to respond and rebuttal. So here's the question. What can you say to a Jewish person about Jesus that will make them examine Judaism? This right here.
Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
Yes, the resurrection of Jesus Christ wasn't a random Jewish person experiencing a miracle like Lazarus. It was a person who claimed to be the Son of Man, as prophesied by the prophet Daniel, being unequivocally vindicated by God. Think about the transfiguration when Moses and Elijah stood next to Jesus, and Peter said, "Hey, can I make 3 tents?" And a voice from heaven said, "No, this is my son. Listen to him." Likewise, after the resurrection of Jesus, God is saying, "This is my son whom defeated death, who has all power and authority. Listen to him." All of the other people who claim to be God, Son of God, anything, they have not done and accomplished what my son did, met all of the righteous requirements, satisfied God's wrath and his justice. A man who knew no sin became sin so we can have the righteousness of God. But how will Ben respond? Let's see.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. Then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
So Ben is simply uninterested in this topic. Nah, Ben is uninterested in having a conversation with Dr. Craig on this topic. That's what it is. Listen, Dr. William Lane Craig did a phenomenal job explaining the historicity of Jesus and the evidence for the resurrection. It is beyond compelling. It is undeniable. This blessed me watching Ben Shapiro hear the gospel truth. Listen, Ben Shapiro is like a brick wall. He's going to hear it, but he's not going to hear it because his pride is blocking that, and perhaps Satan is blinding his eyes from seeing the truth. So my prayer is that God will soften Ben Shapiro's heart to the gospel of Christ, and that he will begin to remember and recall these conversations with people like William Lane Craig and Rody Bauckham and others, and that word will penetrate his heart, soften his heart, and he will gain salvation through Jesus Christ.
Small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Rebbe passed away in the 1990s.
Yes.
And there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have, and they still do that 20 years after his death. You know, that's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experience it. Right. So, you know, especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's sufficient.
I doubt this man's tomb is empty.
Got him!
If you enjoyed this video and you want more content like this, do me a favor and subscribe to this channel. Like this video. I'll be back next week with another one. This is Pastor Frederick. This is About a Book. Peace.